Vice Chair Shelley Bailey, call the Prescription Drug Affordability Board meeting on October 18th, 2023 to order. Melissa, if you can please assist us by calling the roll.
Chair Akil Patterson is excused. Vice Chair Shelley Bailey.
Present.
Dr. Richard Bruno may be joining in progress. Dr. Amy Burns.
Present.
Dr. Daniel Hartan.
Present.
Mr. Robert Judge.
Present.
Mr. John Murray.
Present.
We have a quorum, Vice Chair.
Perfect. Thank you, Melissa. So I want to start off just by asking all the members here today if there are any changes to the draft minutes from the September 20th, 2023 meeting. All right, well, since I don't identify that anyone here has any draft changes that they'd like to propose, I'd like to call for a motion to approve the minutes.
So moved.
And do we have a second? Perfect. Second by Mr. Robert Judge. All right, well, I guess we now call on Executive Director Ralph Magrish to provide us with a program update.
Thank you, Vice Chair.
Excuse me, Vice Chair Bailey, may I do a roll call on the minutes?
Please do. Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you.
Sorry for packing up on that.
No worries. Thank you. Richard Bruno is not arrived. Amy Burns.
Aye.
Daniel Hartan.
Aye.
Robert Judge.
Aye.
John Murray.
Aye.
Shelley Bailey.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Perfect. Thank you, Melissa. So now I'd like to call on Executive Director Ralph Magrish to provide us with a program update.
Good morning, everyone. And Vice Chair Bailey, thank you so much for stepping in and stepping up to lead the meeting on short notice, which we have an excused absence from our chair this morning. First, a couple things, just a brief update to everyone with us this morning. We are going to do just a little bit of agenda shuffling. We are going to do the affordability review conversation first, and then the policy recommendation piece, and we will go from there. So to that point, I want to be the very first person to congratulate John Murray and Robert Judge on the conversions of their appointments from alternates to full board members. I'm very excited about that, and congratulations to you. That followed the effective date of Senate Bill 192 last month. We are still accepting applications for a board vacancy through Workday. We are really encouraging clinicians from rural Oregon to apply for that position vacancy. That is done through Workday, as mentioned, and links to that are prominently displayed in banner atop our PDAB website. So please share that within your networks as well. Also, for folks that have been out or seen the website and peruse the meeting packet today, the new board meeting calendar for 2024 is included now. We are not planning on meeting next July. Thank you, Melissa. And also gratitude to Melissa as well. She's made it super easy for folks to register for meetings, as she's sharing with you by just going over and hovering your cursor over the date, and that will take you directly to a registration link to do that. So thank you for doing that, Melissa. Great stuff. Quick update on Senate Bill 192 rulemaking. And as a reminder to folks, that is the expanded carrier reporting and new pharmacy benefit manager reporting requirements to the PDAB sibling program, the drug price transparency program that is housed at DCBS. A couple pieces on the upcoming rulemaking for that. The current RAC, as mentioned, is scheduled for November 13th. That is a Monday. RAC meetings are open to the public. However, only RAC committee members, and apologies, RAC in the acronym world is Rules Advisory Committee. The RAC has been invited to participate and be seated already. RAC members are the only ones that are allowed to speak during that part of the meeting. Final membership is not yet set. The division has extended invitations to a broad range of stakeholders and interested parties. Pending their acceptance, the agency itself may accept additional members if interested from any other underrepresented organizations or groups. To that point, if so, interested parties can certainly just email the PDAB general inbox on our website, and we will get you in contact with Numi Lee Griffith, who coordinates that. To that point, as mentioned, those are public meetings. Folks will be able to sit in. There will be a public comment period following the end of the Rules Advisory Committee. A second rack will be scheduled in the end of November, early December, if necessary. Consistent with that timeline, we will have a rulemaking hearing in February, with the public comment period running into the last week of February, for an effective rule date of April 1st. So we have that to look forward to. In the same spirit of timing events and saving the date, I will put out to you as a save the date, and this will go up on our websites very soon, if not already. The drug price transparencies public hearing will be held the afternoon of December 7th, I think from 1:30 to 4:30 or 1 to 4. Apologies. We will get that confirmed for you. Very excited to tell you that we have a bipartisan panel of legislators that will be moderating that panel itself, and I am told by my team, thank you, 1:30 to 4, in fact. Very enthused, excited that we have a bipartisan panel of moderators, Representatives Nose, Goodwin, Javadi, and Senator Patterson. The three main pieces of that hearing itself will be highlights and policy recommendations from this year's Drug Transparency Annual Report, and then two panel discussions. The first one, entitled Diabetes Drugs Approved for Weight Loss. Invited presenters will speak about expensive drugs to treat diabetes that are now also approved for chronic weight management in non-diabetic adults with obesity. This conversation and panel will include issues of access, cost, coverage, and equity. The other panel itself discussion entitled will be What Determines the Cost of Generics and Why Are They So Expensive? Invited presenters will speak about why some generics are so expensive that have a very small discount when compared to brand name drugs. And we have invited perspectives to come and discuss that from across the supply and delivery chain. And that concludes my program update, Vice Chair Bailey. If I may, and just keeping the agenda moving, I'd like to go ahead and introduce Jesse O'Brien. Jesse is the policy manager for the Division of Financial Regulation at DCBS. Based on the recent court decision and ruling about copay accumulators, we felt it was in the board's interest on this issue, so I have invited Jesse to speak to this issue on copay accumulators. Jesse, thank you and welcome.
Thanks, Ralph, and good morning. Can everyone hear me? Great. Vice Chair Bailey and members of the board, as Ralph mentioned, I'm Jesse O'Brien. I'm the policy manager with the Division of Financial Regulation, and I was asked to provide a brief summary of a recent court decision in Washington, D.C. related to drug manufacturer-funded patient assistance programs and insurance companies' use of so-called copay accumulator programs. And I will try to keep this brief. It is a little bit of a complicated issue, but I know you have a lot on your plate. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with this already, but for anyone who may be unfamiliar, the term copay accumulator is a sort of confusing term that refers to a practice where an insurer does not count payments made by a third party against a consumer's annual cost sharing limitations. So their deductible or out-of-pocket maximum under their plan. And a third party could include, importantly in this instance, a patient assistance program funded by a drug manufacturer. Several pieces of legislation have been introduced in Oregon over the years that would address this practice in one way or another, banning it or restricting its use, but none of them have passed, and Oregon currently has no specific laws that address the issue. I am aware that there is quite a range of opinions about accumulators, but today I will confine my remarks to just information about the court decision. So the lawsuit leading to the decision was filed by the HIV and Hepatitis Policy Institute, an advocacy organization, challenging a change adopted to federal regulations governing Affordable Care Act regulated health plans under the Trump administration in 2020. And District Judge John Bates vacated that 2020 regulation on administrative procedure grounds. Unfortunately, both the reasoning of the court and the impact of the decision are pretty technical and potentially confusing. So in order to explain the impact of the ruling, I'll give a brief history of how the rule in question has evolved over time. Prior to plan year 2020, the Federal Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, adopted rules defining the term cost sharing for the purposes of ACA implementation, but the definition does not speak specifically to the issue of third-party payments, which led to some confusion around this. In 2019, CMS proposed a rule that would specifically allow copay accumulators for multiple source drugs and explicitly prohibit them for single source drugs. And the motivation for such a rule would presumably be that patient assistance programs for brand name multiple source drugs could encourage the use of drugs that would wind up being more expensive to the healthcare system as a whole, even if the programs reduced the out-of-pocket costs for patients. But with single source drugs, no such concerns apply because there's just the one drug. And there was some pushback from stakeholders to that proposed rule in 2019. After receiving that pushback, the final rule adopted for 2020 still allowed copay accumulators for multiple source drugs and was silent regarding single source drugs. So it removed the language about prohibiting it for single source drugs. And then in 2020, CMS proposed a follow-up rule that effectively said that the meaning of cost sharing is open to interpretation and that insurers could choose whether and when to count third-party payments against cost sharing limitations. And that rule was ultimately adopted, and that is the language that was struck down by the court. So Judge Bates's ruling strikes down the plan year 2021 rule, which effectively reverts back to the language that was originally adopted in 2019, which expressly allows copay accumulators for multiple source drugs and is silent on single source drugs. So confusing though this is, nothing in Judge Bates's ruling suggests that copay accumulators are actually banned with respect to any drugs. The ruling vacates the prior regulation on the grounds that it was arbitrary and capricious and did not align with existing regulatory definitions of the term cost sharing. However, as I said, those existing definitions also do not directly address the accumulator issue. So effectively, the ruling results in continuing to allow copay accumulators. It is quite possible, perhaps even likely, that the federal government will put forward new regulations on the issue, perhaps redefining the term cost sharing or otherwise addressing it. And the judge's ruling specifically identifies that as an option, but we will have to wait and see. And for now, as the state insurance regulator, we still do not have the authority under state law to take any particular action with regard to the practice of copay accumulator programs, and the court decision does not alter that. That's my understanding of where things are at. I'd be happy to take any questions. Robert, please.
Really an outstanding summary on a very complex topic. So thank you for that, Jesse. Was the decision limited to Medicare and ACA?
Yeah, so it would, I believe it was limited specifically to ACA plans because it was addressing the annual ACA related notice of benefit and payment parameters regulations.
Okay. And just as a follow-up then, does that, because this is like an annual event, each legislative session, this topic seems to come up, the vacating the 2020 one rule and, kind of leaving in effect the prior rules, does it have any bearing on Oregon or a state's ability to pass copay accumulator program rules or laws?
I would say no. I think the federal approach to this has always been to allow states to pass their own laws around this. The regulations that have been proposed would have gone into place in states that didn't have laws addressing this, and that if there was a state law explicitly allowing copay accumulators, then maybe that would be preempted if they were prohibited federally, but there's nothing that would prevent Oregon from passing legislation on the issue, I don't think.
Okay, thank you.
Perfect. Well, Jesse, thank you so much for the update. We appreciate it.
Of course.
And I think, Ralph, given the little switcheroo with the agenda here this morning, it seems to me that this is the time for us to do a continuation of the affordability review. Is that correct? And
It
outline.
is.
Okay.
It is. Thank you, Vice Chair Bailey. And I think Melissa's got us teed up for this. Thank you so much. Excited to share this presentation with you and facilitate conversation with Amanda and Breck, and hope this to be a truly interactive conversation and discussion with the board. Melissa, if you would, next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm going to run through the prescribed steps laid out in administrative rule, and it's not going to say I'm going to read this entire thing for you verbatim, but I am going to read the intro, as each of the enumerated pieces will be addressed in the subsequent slides. So Prescription Drug Affordability Board will select from a list of eligible drugs provided under ORS 646A.694 a subset of drugs to prioritize for an affordability review under Oregon Administrative Rule 925-200-0020 by considering the following for selection of prescription drugs. And again, staff and team will collaborate on those, but I want to focus and tee this conversation and discussion up with you on the word considering, and humor me if you will. Our obligation is to consider the following. Consider means just that, according to Merriam-Webster's dictionary. As a transitive verb, it means one, to think about carefully, such as to think about especially with regard to taking some action, or B, to take into account. Second definition, to regard or treat in an attentive or kindly way. Third definition, like this one, to gaze on steadily or reflectively. Fourth definition, to come to judge or classify. The fifth definition, as to regard. Example, his works are well considered abroad. And sixth, and that is to suppose. As an intransitive verb, it means to reflect or deliberate. That's really what we're asking you to do here. That means the extent to which you as a board think about something as important is based on your consideration. If you've reviewed and determined something is not important or less important or informational in context for your work, then you have in fact met that obligation. The breadth and depth of those considerations is up to you, the board, to contemplate and ultimately determine the utility of information, which in some cases you may decide to be very little or none, or alternatively very significant. Some data points you may simply wish to gaze on steadily or reflectively. Others you may wish to take into account. That decision is ultimately yours. I also want to take a couple minutes to level set on the steps that we're taking with these processes consistent with our rules. The substantive piece of determining whether a drug may be unaffordable, as noted, is in the subsequent rule 0020. When we get to that step, you should anticipate staff working with the board to consider, to the extent practical, as stated in rule, the criteria set forth in statute, being ORS 646A.694. Before handing off to Amanda for the next slide, I want to note the information and reports that will be shared and with you on screen. This will be presented based on request from the board from the last meeting, noting that we did and what we discussed at that meeting, and staff evaluating the CCO list and its relationship to the two statutorily defined feeder lists from carriers and manufacturers. And Amanda, take it away with the next slide.
Thank you so much, Ralph, for keying me up there. So number one, consider whether any prescription drugs are on each of the insurer-reported top 25 lists under ORS 743.025. The PDAB team presented data for drugs that insurers reported as the top 25 most prescribed, most costly, and greatest increase in price. Additionally, we presented the top drugs across those lists. Based on the suggestion from the September board meeting, we have taken the top drugs from those lists and combined them with any additional drugs from the top 25 most costly drugs listed on the Coordinated Care Organization, or CCO, report that was previously shared. Data listed for those additional drugs was pulled from the carrier reported data. This new list was labeled as the PDAB working drug list and is posted on our website. Please note that while we have not excluded drugs from the manufacturer list from consideration, based on the September board meeting recommendation, it sounds as though the board may be interested in using the PDAB working drug list that was compiled of the top drugs from the carrier data and the CCO list as a potential subset of drugs. With that, is this the list the board wishes to continue forward with for the remainder of the criteria?
So Amanda, I guess I first want to thank you for taking Dr. Hartung's, comments from the last meeting and combining them and scrubbing them based on the carrier list. And so, at least from my perspective, keeping the list the way that you've provided it based on the feedback last week is in alignment with our discussions from last week. Or excuse me, last month, sorry.
Do we have any other thoughts or questions from the board? Ralph, is there anything?
Robert, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, I just want to kind of weigh in with and concur with Vice Chair Bailey's comments. I think the time that we spent last month to reconcile not only what was provided on the carrier list, but make sure that consideration was given to drugs on the CCO list, because the demographics of the utilization for drugs on the CCO within CCOs is different. I'm totally on board with this approach.
Great. And other thoughts from board members?
I'm in agreement as well. I like the direction that we're headed, so thank you.
Great. Thank you all. And I do not believe a motion is necessary. I think we can continue, Amanda. Thank you.
Oh, excellent. Melissa, can you go to the next slide then? Number 2, consider whether the prescription drug is included in the manufacturer new drug report or price increase report under ORS 646A.689 for the previous calendar year. PDAB received manufacturer reported data under ORS 646A.689 that had an annual price increase of 10% or more and was $100 or more for a 1-month supply. Manufacturing reporting also includes new specialty drugs when the price of the NDC exceeds $670, the $670 threshold set by CMS. Staff reviewed the new specialty drugs, and what we found was that many of the drugs that were reported on the new specialty report were actually new forms of existing drugs, so just a new strength, dosage, packaging. We did conduct additional review on the manufacturer annual increase report, and we identified 2 drugs that the board may wish to consider reviewing. And with that, Melissa, would you be able to pull up the manufacturer annual increase report onto the screen? Excellent. Thank you, Melissa. From that list, there were 2 drugs that we found were wound up on the most costly in terms of the total cost, the greatest increase in cost that was reported in 2021 or 2022, my apologies, and had the highest cost per unit. And that was Macy and Kavaius. So I'm just going to filter on that data real quick so the board can see the information that was reported for those drugs by the manufacturers, as well as the ranks that we gave for those 2 drugs. Macy and Kavaius, once again, were identified when compared to the other drugs as being in the top 25 across all 3 categories. These categories are similar to what we use for the carrier data, but do use different data points because they come from a different source. So based on that, we looked at these drugs as maybe 2 potential drugs the board may wish to consider. Upon further examination, we did want to note that Macy does not appear to meet the definition of a prescription or physician administered drug. It looks like it may be closer to a procedure in nature. And the other caveat I do want to include is that the price information that's included in the manufacturer annual increase report is based upon wholesale acquisition cost, or WAC, and is not necessarily reflective of the cost of patients at the point of sale. With that information, would the board want to consider reviewing Macy and Kavaius for the affordability reviews?
I mean, I can just share, Amanda, thank you for your deep review into this. And I know I was one of the board members who suggested we don't, that we rely on manufacturer data, that we look at it, but that maybe we don't focus on it. But I appreciate you kind of finding what might be outliers in it. Mm-hmm. I will say, because they has a different data source, and we aren't able to see the claimants and some of the things that we're able to see from the other data sources. I guess I personally my thoughts might be to remove them. If we did add one, I would say that we would add the Kavaius, just because that seems to be a drug that we could more readily compare against other drugs. But I know some of the, physicians here, especially ones from things, maybe you have some thoughts that you might be able to share. Dr. Bruno, I can see you raised your hand.
Oh, thanks, Vice Chair Bailey. I'm not familiar with either of these drugs, but I would imagine that PC is probably an injectable, like a joint injection. I'd have to look it up and see. And Kavaius looks like it's used for like a periodic paralysis. So these are not drugs I'm familiar with, like in a primary care basis. But I'm also recognizing that they probably don't meet the criteria that we're probably looking for specifically. So in order to make like a more informed decision, I would probably have to take a deeper dive into these. But on the surface, they're not looking like drugs that I think are going to be ones that would be a really good target for our work here.
Perfect. That makes sense. Thank you for adding that. Dr. Burns?
Yeah, so I did look up Macy. I don't think that it falls within the context of this work that we're doing. It's something that has to be surgically implanted. It doesn't really fit here, even though obviously the price tag seems fairly high. It's one of those things, kind of like CAR T therapy, where you're mixing, medical procedure with something that could possibly be construed as a drug. So I would vote that we don't look at that. I don't think that, as you pointed out, Chairperson, that it will be easily comparable. And there are plenty of other things for us to look at. I don't feel strongly either way about the Kavaius. So.
Perfect. Thank you. Before we move forward, does anyone else have thoughts about either of these two medications? Oh, Dr. Hartung, I see you raised your hand.
Just from a more procedural standpoint, these are so I get this straight, these came up in terms of the manufacturer provided drugs that had the greatest price increase that weren't already on our carrier kind of our carrier-based CCO list. Is that kind of correct?
That is correct, Dr. Hartung. And neither of these drugs appeared on any of the top 25 lists for our carriers.
Okay. Yeah, I'm pretty unfamiliar with both. And so, I don't think that should be the criteria for if we decide to determine whether they are or not, but I agree with the kind of the prevailing opinions of my board members on this one.
Perfect, thank you. And Mr. Murray?
I also would concur with the opinions being expressed here. I also, though I should have at the beginning of the meeting, I was advised to declare a conflict of interest whenever we discuss individual agents. And so I guess I will do that as a potential conflict of interest. I apologize for not doing it sooner, but because I own Murray's pharmacies, at best, at most, I have a potential conflict of interest. So please, thank you.
Thank you for sharing that today. And Mr. Robert Judge?
Yeah, just to make sure that I'm tracking, I'm in total alignment with what the conversation has stated so far. But in terms of how we look at the manufacturer data in general, my recollection was that when we talked about this last month, we were going to focus on kind of the amalgamation of the top 25 and the CCO data and use that as our starting list. And then when we get into an affordability review, we would look at supplemental data like that, which is available through the manufacturer list to help us kind of in the affordability discussions. Am I tracking you correctly with what we said?
Sure, board member Judge, if I may, I think you're tracking that 80% correct. I would say that the next phase will be a roll-up of lots of different supplemental information, largely informed by the carrier data request, for which the carrier information is coming back that our data team is processing now. And to that point, the all payer, all claims database, if we are able to discern gross utilization, paid amounts, things of that nature across the state. And then, of course, all the collateral information that we may seek from patient groups, constituents, and or manufacturers, amongst others.
Totally agree with that, Ralph. It's a much broader data set that we'd be looking at, one of which would be the manufacturer reported data. Got it. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda, for sharing this information and bringing it to our attention. I know that you're tasked with, finding the outliers based on our original rules. So thank you for bringing this to our group's attention. I don't believe we need a vote on this, but I do just want to make sure to mention that for the record, it seems to me as vice chair that as a group, we've decided that for the affordability review we'll be working on, that we will not be adding Macy or Cabeas.
Excellent. Thank you, Vice Chair Bailey. Ralph, Breck, anything that you want to add before we move it over to the WAC slide? The next slide?
No, thank you, Amanda. Nothing.
All right. Well, thanks so much to the board for having me. I'm really enjoying this this great discussion we're having. So as a part of the process of selecting a subset of drugs for affordability reviews, point 3 states that the board should consider the current and historical change in a drug's wholesale acquisition cost. And this is also known as WAC. And just a quick, reminder of what wholesale acquisition cost means. It's basically the estimate of the manufacturer's list price for a drug when they sell to wholesalers or, direct purchasers. And it does not include discounts or rebates, and it's not the price that, a pharmacy, payer, or claimant would, probably be paying for the drug. So because of that, this number should likely not be used as an actual estimate of the cost of the drug to payers, claimants, and so on, right? However, it could potentially provide some insight to the board around any trends in the drug's cost. So is the drug getting more expensive over time? If so, how rapidly is the price changing? And again, that's really what the board should consider here, the current and historical change in a drug's wholesale acquisition cost. And within this, there's two metrics that I'd really like to bring the board's attention to. So Melissa, if you'd be so kind as to bring up the working drug list sheet. All right, so the metrics are in columns K and L. So column K, right, this shows the percent change in a drug's wholesale acquisition cost from the beginning of 2022 to the end of 2022. And then column L shows that same trend, yet averaged over the past 5 years. So over the past 5 years, what was the average year-over-year percent change in WAC? And these are kind of the two major columns that we can consider. Columns I and J also have some information pertinent to WAC, and you can sort of read and glean what those are, but K and L I think kind of might be the most interesting. So really now the board can now discuss and determine or consider, as you work towards a list of drugs to be considered for affordability reviews, do you want to use information about current and historical WAC changes to filter any drugs off this list, or to add any drugs to this list?
Thank you, Breck. I guess Robert Judge might be.
No, you were,
Fine. Go ahead, Mr. Robert Judge.
you were gonna go, Vice Chair Bailey. Go ahead. I'll go after you.
Oh, I was just going to quote you. So my comment, or at least my thoughts on quoting you. I guess where my head was going related to the information you presented, Breck, was that as we're trying to get our kind of global list, that maybe a deeper dive relative to WAC changes and things is more part of the review itself, but not necessarily part of what we're tasked with achieving today. So that was just my kind of 2 cents. So my perspective would be that we would not exclude drugs based on the WAC changes at this time. But Mr. Robert Judge or Dr. Hartung?
Vice Chair Bailey, just maybe kind of supplement that. So I think it would be premature for the board to make a decision to exclude WAC from consideration. Well, ultimately, I don't think WAC has a direct bearing on what patients pay for drugs. They definitely do give insight into a part of the supply chain that does impact the cost of drugs at point of sale and pharmacy. So it's a factor that I think we'd want to make sure that we had the ability to at least consider as we go through affordability reviews.
Yeah, to clarify, I guess my perspective was we just wouldn't narrow with WAC at this stage, but that in the future WAC would be part of our discussion.
Yeah.
Dr. Hartung?
I guess a couple questions here. So are we talking about just changes in WAC or WAC itself? Was that the question posed?
So at least
As the data piece to consider?
So the rule states that the board should consider the current and historical change in a drug's wholesale acquisition cost.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, this is a thorny issue. I think changes in WAC, you get a general gist of where the drug is gone, drug pricing has gone. I assume we're going to have other information that have better insights on net prices and net costs to different stakeholders here. I will say that WAC is directly tied to out-of-pocket costs for some patient segments. And so for that reason, it's kind of has a direct relevance. And so I'd hesitate to really totally discount it. So I would like to consider year-to-year changes in WAC, both as you have it here, like kind of this the 2022 or the last year change, as well as a more historical look at, you know, the last 5-10 years or so, maybe 5 years. Because I mean, I think you see here some differences, some variation across these different groups that, you know, I think depending on competition and within categories, you have greater increases in WAC that may be related to the competitive issues in terms of the market for that particular drug.
So I guess for purposes of today in creating our list, are you then proposing, Dr. Hartung, that you do want to make sure that we're filtering out certain drugs as we're creating this list? And if so, is there a WAC change threshold that you're proposing?
Oh,
From my perspective, that's for the next stage, just my own perspective. But for purposes of narrowing the list, am I hearing you correctly that you're suggesting that we narrow based on some of the WAC deltas?
no, I was just saying that I'd like to look at it or consider it in the larger list. I don't have a threshold that I think we should consider, but it might be helpful if when we're again looking at this larger list, it might be a data element that I think helps us select the smaller list. So I guess if the question is totally removing it from consideration, I don't want to do that. I would like to consider it more in the larger list.
Okay, I mean, understood. I think we're kind of saying, at least the way I'm feeling is that many of us are saying the same thing, that we don't want to filter out anything at this time based on WAC changes, but we want to have the flexibility once we move into the full affordability review to evaluate WAC. Am I hearing the conversation accurately? Is that I see some heads nodding. Mr. Murray?
Yes, I would like to leave it as part of the conversation as we go forward, and excuse me, and not remove them from remove any medications from this list at this point. It is, you know, from my perspective, it's hard to see the year-over-year price increase over the last 5 years that greatly outpaces inflation, for example. It's hard to explain drug increases to my patients when they're considerably more than they might see in their daily world as far as wages and things like that. Just an offhanded comment.
Perfect. So as I relook at what Breck presented to us a few minutes ago, you know, our question was, do we want to use WAC to remove any drugs from the subset list? So what I'm hearing is that we don't want to use WAC to remove anything, and we will keep WAC as part of the things we consider as we move in future meetings into full review. So, oh, Ralph, I see.
Yeah, I think, sure, I think,
Apologies, Ralph.
no problem. Vice Chair Bailey, I think what you just said really articulates it well. And just a friendly reminder to the board that this exercise today is really focused on selecting a subset of drugs, and to the kind of point/question that Dr. Hartung asked around WAC and the importance of it. All of that will be kind of complemented or illuminated with the de-identified carrier data, and to the point that he made, I think, about WAC impacting patient out-of-pocket cost, et cetera. So I do see it as complementary. So I think that this is a good discussion, and I think that there is kind of no harm, no foul in keeping that. This is the point of this exercise, because it will be seen as complementary to the 0020 piece when we get there, if that helps folks or confuses them. And I might pause because I see Dr. Burns I just want to check in and make sure that that tracks with folks.
No, I don't have any comment.
Okay, great. Thank you, Vice Chair Bailey.
So it's my understanding we won't use WAC to remove or add anything. And that we will move on to slide number 4 for someone from the team to present to our group. And
Thank you very
oh, perfect. Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you very much, Vice Chair Bailey. Next, number 4, consider the date the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, approval of the prescription drug, and whether the prescription drug was approved through an expedited pathway. Expedited pathway approval includes fast track, priority review, accelerated approval, breakthrough therapy designations, and additionally, for brand name drugs and biological products, whether there were any approved and marketed generic drugs or biosimilar drugs for the specific brand name drug or biological product. And I know that is quite a lot of points to consider here. Melissa, if you can pull up the working drug list, we will go through some of those data points. I know number 4 is essentially 5 points of consideration in a trench coat. So excellent. Thank you so much, Melissa. So we researched drugs approved by the FDA through an expedited pathway, which can be found in column AE of the working drug list. So I'm going to just scroll over a little bit here because I know it's a pretty long list. So you'll see whether it's marked as a yes or no for the approval through an expedited pathway. So once again, that includes fast track, priority review, breakthrough therapy designations. We researched and noted any drugs that were listed as having a therapeutic equivalent in the Orange Book. And for biologics, if either the drug itself was considered a biosimilar or had a biosimilar listed in the Purple Book. You can find this information in column AC of the working drug list. You'll see that it'll be listed as none listed if we did not see one in the Orange or Purple Book. And then yes, if one, it was designated as such in these FDA resources. We researched if the drug listed was a brand name or generic version of the drug. If the drug, since some of these are grouped together, multiple forms of the drug, if some forms or brands were a brand name and some forms were a generic, we mark that as both in our data tables across our various reports. And you can find that information in column AB of this report. So we did have one drug that, or a few drugs when we added in the coordinated care organization data, they have both brand and generic forms of the drugs. Though the bulk of the list you can see all show as brand name versions of the drug. With that information, and real quick, Ralph or Breck, is there any additional context you wish to add?
Not here. Thanks, Amanda.
With that, does the board want to use the approval date and expedited pathway to remove or add drugs from the subset list? Robert Judge?
I will just get started. I think it's axiomatic that newer drugs are more expensive than older drugs. Although those drugs that have very long patent lives, so they keep on getting patent extensions, we've seen that over time, that those prices continue to increase as well. But I do think that it may be helpful to look at the approval date and even an expedited pathway as a consideration to maybe factor into the subset list and narrow it down.
Dr. Hartung, I think you had your hand up, or excuse me, Dr. Burns, I think you had your hand up next.
Yeah, I have a comment, but I have a question for for Robert real quick. Robert, when you say that, do you mean if you wanted to factor in how, if it was approved sooner rather than later? Can you clarify what you're saying there?
Yeah, that's thorny, right? I mean, I think the more recently the availability of a drug, the more likely it is that we'd want to make sure that it stayed on the list. And the further back we looked, the more likely it is we may cull it from the list. But what that window is, whether it's a few years, 5 years, or longer, I don't have an opinion on yet.
Okay. So for my comment, I would say that no, we don't want to necessarily look at these factors as something that we would want to use to add or remove. I don't necessarily disagree with Robert, but I would point out that there are some drugs on here that have been on the market for 20 plus years. And of, for whatever reason, continue to be a challenge for patients and for the system to maintain or control costs. So I don't know that that necessarily would be something that I would think that we'd want to really take into consideration, although I don't disagree that, like, there is, as you pointed out, the idea that newer drugs are more expensive. Likewise, with whether or not there is a biosimilar or a therapeutic equivalent, I would also say that we don't want to use that as a reason to remove something from the list, at least not at this time.
Dr. Hartung?
Yeah, I agree with you, Amy. This notion, these issues around fast track, breakthrough designation, this all denotes some sort of, either lack of existing therapies that the FDA can. It's kind of about the evidence base and what other therapies are out there, and maybe the FDA allowed drugs to be approved with perhaps a thinner evidence. And I feel like that's important. I think when we go through the affordability reviews themselves, we can consider, with help from probably other experts who may have contributions to the affordability reviews. But I feel like from just this first pass, probably don't want to use that information too strongly to make decisions about what is and what not isn't potentially an affordability issue. And from this perspective of length, when the FDA originally approved it, I agree with what you said, Amy, that we have my work with MS. We have therapies with MS that have been around for 25 years that cost just as much as the ones that have been approved in the last 5 years. So that would be my comment, that age of the vintage of the drug, I don't think we should use that to again make this first COLDA list, this first pass.
So Ralph, I see that you raised your hand. I also had a comment I was going to add after Dr. Hartung, but if you'd like to go first.
Thank you. First comment and compliment, and thank you, Dr. Hartung, and everyone for the depth and richness of this conversation and discussion. This is exactly what we were hoping to achieve today. To that point, a couple things, and we may tap Dr. Hartung at some point, because I want to make sure that not just board members, but people that are watching today have an understanding of what he spoke to around the approval process of drugs on expedited pathways, and some of those things and what they actually mean through the FDA process of using surrogate endpoints when sound long-term clinical data may not be available. So I do think that is important. But I also want to note that the board, if the board is ready to select a subset of drugs today, or if that process does happen kind of default, how will orphan drugs only be looked at on this list. To the point is, the law does not permit them to be subject to an affordability review. So I do just want to say that piece out loud as a part of this conversation. But again, thank you, Dan, for the flag on what some of those evidentiary pieces might be.
And Dr. Hartung?
Yeah, I had a quick follow-up based on that question, Ralph. On the orphan drug list, or the orphan drug indications, does that mean if it has any orphan indication, we can't consider it, or if it has a bunch of other non-orphan indications?
Sure. So thank you for that. As a
I always
point,
get confused about that.
yep. So as point of clarification, we wrote the administrative rule to say that should a drug be approved for multiple indications, of which one of them is an orphan designation, that would not preclude us from doing an affordability review on it. If a drug is solely approved for an orphan indication, we are prohibited by statute from looking at it. That answers your question.
Yes.
So I guess something I wanted to share was, I guess related to orphan, my perspective would be that we remove orphan right now, because I think one of the challenges is, it's my understanding that during this meeting, we are supposed to kind of leave this meeting with our narrowed down list for affordability reviews. So when we think just logistically of what's meaningful and what's not, like Amanda, maybe you could scroll down to show how many, based on what we've been discussing, you know, how many drugs are on this list. I can guess at what I think the number is, but I certainly also keeping in mind that insulin is another discussion that we have to have. I believe that we haven't narrowed our list down enough to be logistically feasible. And so, you know, having our discussion about kind of the, I guess my question to Amanda was going to be, could you help us narrow some of the criteria based on that, the discussion we were having, just for purposes of seeing what the list would look like if we narrow drugs that are going to expire within 18 months, and if we removed ones with multiple generics, just so that we could kind of visually see where we're at now and what this would otherwise look like. Because we do have to, my understanding is we really are supposed to make our best effort at narrowing this list today.
Yes, of course. So for starters, if we remove the orphan only designations, then that takes our count down to 27 drugs on, or I'm sorry, 26 drugs on this list. And if we want to include the ones that have both the orphan and non-orphan designations and solely focus on non-orphan drugs, that would reduce the list down to, let's see, I think it's 17 drugs, 18 drugs. And then you also...
And maybe this is the place to pause for everyone to talk. I was just kind of asking, I do want to recognize that Dr. Burns had her hand raised. And sorry, I missed that, Dr. Burns.
No, it's okay. That I was gonna ask Amanda if she could filter by orphan. That's why I lowered my hand. We're good.
And then, but I also realized Ralph raised his hand. So Ralph.
Sure. Thank you. So to the point that was made about the administrative work involved in if there should be an ideal number or target to that today, I would say the answer to that is no. And that this is an important context, that we have a statutory charge to identify 9 drugs that create affordability challenges for the healthcare system or high out-of-pocket cost for Oregonians. To that point, I would have some concerns about us going too far into making the list of drugs that we do that deep dive into too shallow or too narrow, for the point that, and I say this broadly to everyone, we may not, we are looking at all these issues and topics with open eyes and open minds. And to that point, we may, if we were to shorten the list too narrow, it could be conceivable that we would not identify 9 subject drugs. So I would just provide that level of caution, but yet appreciation for recognition of the list that's involved with staff. I'll be honest, Vice Chair Bailey, I'm really reluctant to provide a level of guidance like that, despite my role as leadership role in this. I want this to be a board-driven decision. So to that point, I would task that back to you as the board.
All right, thank you, Ralph. Dr. Hartung?
Well, so if the rules state that we're not allowed to do affordability reviews on drugs that have one indication and it's an orphan indication, or one orphan, or just solely orphan indication or indications, it seems to me like it's pretty safe. Then we just scrub them from the list. That would be a safe variable to use.
Thank you for sharing that. It makes sense.
Right? Is that what people think?
Yeah, and Mr. Robert Judge?
I'm seconding what Dan just said. Let's be prudent, but let's not be overly aggressive on this at this stage. Let's stick to what our rule says. And I think that calls it down to 27, right?
So once again, doing orphan, as long as there's a non-orphan indication.
Right.
In addition. So it looks like that will pull us down to 26.
26, okay.
Mr. Murray?
My question was, where were we including the drugs with one orphan indication, but also non-orphan? So is that what you were saying, Dr. Hartung, that we should include those if they have an other non-orphan indication?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's pretty common nowadays that drugs would be, they get brought to market with an orphan indication, and then non-orphan indications get tacked on later. It seems like it's a strategy.
So logistically, how would we achieve that if we know that there's both orphan and non-orphan
I
uses?
think Vice Chair Bailey, Amanda's able to filter in that column Y if she is to filter out orphan only. I think that gets us there, which she has done. So
Yes, and you'll see here, so for example, like Humira has both non-orphan and orphan designations, which makes sense. Humira covers a host of indications. So I think too, the question is, would the board be more interested in considering those drugs that have no orphan designations whatsoever, or include those that as long as they have at least one non-orphan designation?
Can you show us what it looks like? And Mr. Robert Judge, could you show us what it looks like with both orphan and non-orphan?
Yes, so that's what's currently on the screen in terms of.
Okay, I was just looking to filter from, okay. Yeah, so
And then, so that would be 26 drugs. And then if you only focus on those that have no orphan indications whatsoever, then that decreases the list down to 18 drugs.
Yeah.
Mr. Judge?
Vice Chair Bailey, when you made your comment, just to want to clarify my understanding of it, was it intended to, if we have a drug that has at least one orphan indication, but it's not exclusively an orphan drug, was your question about how would we do that consideration?
I
around that drug?
was thinking ahead, and so I'll even table that comment. I was just
Okay,
thinking
yeah,
of access
okay.
to data and diagnosis codes and things, so it wasn't the right comment for the right time.
Got it. Well,
Which is
yeah.
me.
I'll say it again. I believe we're doing the right thing by sticking to the rule and removing from this list drugs that are orphan drugs only.
All right, then I'm going to add those ones that have both orphan and non-orphan back in conceptually. But Vice Chair Bailey, you also mentioned some additional data points. Was one whether or not they have a therapeutic equivalent of biosimilar?
Yes, that was one of the comments, but I also, hear what Ralph said about we want to be mindful of not narrowing it too much, but I'd like to see that since I mentioned it and sounds like you're proposing sharing that.
Of course. So if we remove the drugs that show a therapeutic equivalent or a biosimilar per the orange and purple books, and then we've narrowed out those orphan-only designations, that takes the list down to a count of 19 drugs.
Got it. Thank you for sharing this, Mr. Murray. Oh, Ralph, maybe.
If I may, because John actually may be the better person to speak to this, or Robert, but noting for not just board members, but everyone with us today, that just because a drug has an approved therapeutic equivalent or biosimilar does not mean that it is manufactured, does not mean it is in the pipeline or the supply chain or in a wholesaler's warehouse near you that could be available. So I just want to make that as a known statement that there's no guarantee that that product is out there in the marketplace. But perhaps John or Robert could speak to that, and I don't want to detract from either of the comments or questions that they want to make. Thank you.
Yes, if you don't mind, I had my original question, and I'll address that in just a moment, Ralph, is that what is our target today? I guess I'm having a difficulty I don't want to get too low, but we need to have a certain number to choose from. What is our number looking like? But to address the topic that Ralph brought up, yes, there's medications on this list. Some of them are just have new generics on the market. And what happens to me, and what's happened to about 10 patients in my pharmacies over the past month, is that drug will be hit by the PBMs, and they'll say, well, now that this generic has been approved, we will only reimburse you at the generic rate. We can't get the generic. We can't find anywhere. We can't order it. And then we have only the brand. The patient is going to pay full price for the brand because the PBM has said they're only reimbursing for generic. And here this patient went from $20 copay up to a $250 prescription. Incredibly frustrating. And we call on prior authorizations, we call on exceptions to try to get these patients their medication. But yeah, we see it every single week. It's incredibly frustrating.
And thank you for sharing that, Mr. Murray. And Ralph, did you want to answer Mr. Murray's question before?
I will reluctantly state this, as several board members have raised this issue, is there a number that is manageable? I'm going to say somewhere in that 18 to 22 number is probably a realistic exercise. But to that point, again, I want to note that the goal of today's conversation is to consider each of these, and that is the exercise that we're doing. And to that point, however big the list is, as the chips may land after that conversation, that is what staff will do to support the board in its mission. So a bit of a non-answer, but an answer. So appreciate your question. Thank you.
And Mr. Judge?
Thank you, Vice Chair. And John, I understand your point entirely, and I agree with the points that you're making. It's an unfortunate consequence that often when you get a generic or a biosimilar, that the market tends to, or the PBM industry tends to kind of peg that as the reimbursed amount, which makes it really, really difficult on pharmacies that can't get access to those drugs if it's in limited supply. Having said that, I do think biosimilarity, or the availability of biosimilars, should be an item that we not filter out at this point. It should be something that we may consider in an affordability review. And that's because the availability of a biosimilar, in my mind, really gives you insight to pricing over time from the original product. So I would not make any decision on biosimilarities at this point.
So am I hearing you right, Mr. Judge, that you maybe would like to see the data by filtering out drugs that also have a biosimilar, or did I hear that?
Flip it around. Let's not use the availability of a biosimilar as a technique to call the list.
Thank you. And Dr. Burns?
Yeah, I'll just make it quick. I agree with John and Robert.
And Mr. Murray?
Again, and I would add to Mr. Judge's comments about the availability of bioequivalents. And then what catches my attention is the amount of time it's been on the market. When was it first approved by the FDA? And so to see it not decrease in price over the years, or whether there's a bioequivalent or generic available, is frustrating to me.
And Dr. Bruno?
I just want to agree with the team here about not using that AC column, about having a biosimilar available
Not
in the assessment. Yeah.
Okay. So Amanda, can you scroll down then and show us how many are on our list right now? Again, keeping in mind that we haven't had our insulin discussion yet as well.
Yes, I'm going to remove that filter on the therapeutic equivalent.
Thank you for catching that.
Yes, so when we add those back,
Okay, go ahead.
when we add those back in, then we're at 26. And if I recall, I think maybe patent expiration and exclusivity were maybe mentioned as possible filters. We do have those on another slide, so I may postpone that discussion for when we get to those slides.
Okay, so we have 26 essentially on our list, reflective of what the board has discussed so far. Dr. Bruno?
Oh, sorry. Vestigial hand there. I'll take that down.
Oh, no problem. Okay, well, would it be appropriate for us to kind of move forward with some of the additional slides that Amanda was going to present to us? Oh, thank you, Melissa.
All right, and back to me for considering where there are therapeutic alternatives, cost availability, and potential of alternatives. So this area presents some unique challenges and opportunities. Again, the rule requires the board to consider therapeutic alternatives. What does that mean to the board? What will you want to see? Our staff recommendation is to manage the scope of this project and substantively consider these as a part of the selected subset in the 0020 rule. Given the main source of data on both cost and availability of therapeutic alternatives do not come into play until that next rule as part of the determination of affordability. This will inform whether a drug creates affordability challenges for the healthcare system or high out-of-pocket costs. So ultimately, the question to the board for discussion, is this important to you now in selecting a subset, or should we do this when we have the subset? And that's what we'd like to open for discussion here.
Thank you, Ralph. Mr. Robert Judge?
I have a question of Ralph and then a comment. In a future state, Ralph, if we make a decision to use therapeutic alternatives as a consideration in our deep dive, is there a way to break out in that column those drugs that have therapeutic equivalents versus those drugs that have biosimilarities?
Without the benefit of one of our clinical support folks, I believe the answer would be yes. I don't see why we would not be able to do that.
I think that would be helpful. So, with that as kind of a response, I don't think we should use therapeutic equivalents as a culling factor off of this list today.
Dr. Hartung, I saw you had your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Robert's comment. I don't think we should use this to further call the list at this point. I think will be informative. Again, for the affordability reviews, we consider therapeutic equivalents therapeutic alternatives. So not equivalent, but drugs that are similar clinically. And again, when we have that clinical support piece in place for those reviews, we can get a better sense that of what other options are available.
Perfect, thank you. Does anyone else want to chat further about therapeutic alternatives at this time?
But if I can seek a point of clarification from Robert that he noted, are you referring to therapeutic alternatives? Because I'm just want to make sure that staff has direction in that if the board agreed not to filter based on expedited pathway, trying to kind of discern what the intersect would be between not filtering on expedited pathway and the potential universe of therapeutic alternatives. I just maybe want to seek a point of clarification.
In my kind of thinking, expedited pathway is a different topic entirely than therapeutic equivalence. And because expedited pathway really talks to kind of new arrivals in the marketplace that may be, orphan drug, may not be. They aren't necessarily expedited for therapeutic equivalence. So my where I was getting to, Ralph, was therapeutic. There's a difference, and I'm not a clinician, but there's a difference between therapeutic alternatives versus therapeutic equivalency. So I'll leave it to the experts to kind of school us on that. But I think whether it's an alternative or an equivalent, that's a discussion for the next round when we get into the affordability reviews.
Great, thank you.
Dr. Hartog?
Oh yeah, I just wanted to clarify, Robert said it, that there's a difference between therapeutic alternatives. That's what it says in the therapeutic alternatives versus, equivalents, or what I would interpret as bioequivalent kind of substitutable drugs at the pharmacy, versus therapeutic alternatives would be different molecules that have effectively do the same thing. They may or may not be clinically equivalent. It may be open to interpretation, and all that stuff I think would need to be sussed out in the affordability review. But as the question here, number 5, consider the therapeutic alternatives. I don't think we need to, that's a tall order to even figure out what the therapeutic alternatives of some of these drugs would be at this point. So I suggest we don't do it.
Perfect. Thank you for sharing that. That seems kind of the general consensus, just for the record, that related to number 5, we would not consider therapeutic alternatives on our subset of drugs for purposes of making our master list today. So Amanda, would you be able to move on to the next topic of discussion for slide or point number 6?
Yes, thank you very much, Vice Chair. Number 6, consider whether the prescription drugs have a patent expiration or exclusivity expiration date within the next 18 months. I referenced patent and exclusivity dates for drugs using the FDA's orange and purple books, marking if the latest patent and exclusivity date listed for the drug expires within the next 18 months. And Melissa, if you can pull up the working drug list again. We'll pull that data onto screen. Thank you so much, Melissa. So the patent expiration and exclusivity date information can be found in columns A and G of the working drug list. So here and here, you'll see no data listed for quite a few drugs. These are cases where I could not find a patent listed associated with any of the application numbers for the drug in the orange book or the purple book. I did want to put a few caveats about there are some data limitations when we're looking at our patent and exclusivity data. First and foremost, there may be additional types of patents that are not listed in the orange and purple book. So there may be additional patents floating around there that are not considered relevant by the FDA for the orange and purple book, but may still come into play. Patents may not apply to all forms of the drug. So you may see a patent expiring within the next 18 months where perhaps some forms of the drug are no longer under patent. The expiration date of a patent may be changed due to litigation, resulting in either a shorter period of exclusivity or a longer period of exclusivity. And finally, patent thickets are a very common practice, resulting in several patents existing for the same drug, with additional patents being filed periodically. And Ralph or Breck, is there any other information you'd like to add before I can turn it over to the board?
No, thank you, Amanda.
Esteemed board, based on that information, does the board want to use the patent and exclusivity expiration dates, essentially those that expire within the next 18 months, to remove or add any drugs from the subset list?
Mr. Robert Judge?
Amanda, could you do me a favor and just maybe filter on if we said we're only going to look at drugs with, it makes it a very short list.
It looks like patent expiration next month is one drug, and then exclusivity would be 4 impacted drugs. So it looks like 4 drugs total.
That's a pretty obvious answer in my book.
Dr. Burns?
I think that Robert's obvious answer, and tell me if I'm wrong, was yeah, you do want to exclude it. I'm not sure. Well, just so I know what I'm coming after.
Oh,
Can you-
so yeah, sorry. I was thinking that because if we look at consideration, we essentially winnow this list down to just a couple of drugs. So I would say, don't look at that.
Don't look at that. Yeah, okay.
But you're not saying move them. Just so I
Pardon?
understand what you're saying.
Pardon?
Are you saying to keep them on the list based on that, or are you suggesting to remove those from the list?
Keep them on the list.
Keep them on the list, but not obviously focus on them exclusively.
Yeah.
Okay. Dr. Burns?
And I would agree with that because quite frankly, just because they might have an expiration date in 18 months doesn't mean that that's actually come to fruition in 18 months. So, this is a story that's very common where the manufacturer will have a new indication that comes out, or they file a new patent based on a device, like how it's given. So I don't really think that that's reliable in the sense that just because it's going to expire in 18 months means that it's going to expire in 18 months. So to me, that's like, we should not be taking that into consideration.
Thank you. And Mr. Murray?
I was going to say the same things that Dr. Burns and Mr. Judge said, so thank you.
So it's my understanding that based on the discussion we've had so far, that we would make no changes to the list based on patent expirations or potential patent expirations within 18 months. So with that said, maybe before we move to the next slide, Amanda, you could just scroll down to kind of show us kind of yet again the master list we have. And
Yes.
drugs.
So yes, when we remove the orphan-only designations, we are currently at 26, which is a much more manageable list than when we look at all the different sources of data that the PDAP team started with, where if, when we're looking at manufacturer reporting and that, and we had hundreds of drugs, if you're going with this list, and once again, that's the board's decision, at 26 drugs, that would allow, from a functionality standpoint, that would allow DCBS staff to do a little more thoughtful review.
Thank you, Amanda, for sharing that. Mr. Robert Judge?
Yeah, just to make a comment, it's probably obvious. I'm comfortable with this list. Because many of the factors that we talked about, I think will need to be factors that we consider in an affordability review. None of them rise to the level, other than the orphan status, to cull the list immediately. So I'm comfortable with where we're ending up.
Thank you for sharing that, Mr. Judge. Does anyone else have any thoughts they want to share related to this list we have compiled thus far? Before, not sure the procedural next steps, but I'm assuming we would need to verbalize the list or somehow take screenshots and vote on it. Ralph or team may be able to provide guidance, but I just want to make sure we all have an opportunity to add anything before we advance to that step.
Sure. Thank you, Vice Chair Bailey. I don't believe any formal vote is necessary, although I see Dr. Bruno raising his hand, so we'll pause there. I believe that having had informal consensus conversation with board, I think we have clear direction. I'm comfortable with that. But let me open for Dr. Bruno and John Murray in case they had additional questions.
Perfect. Thank you,
I was
Ralph.
just saying, oh, thank you, Vice Chair. I just wanted to say I'm also comfortable moving forward, and I do have to peel off early, and I apologize.
Thank you, Dr. Bruno. And Mr. Murray?
I wanted to express that I'm pleased with the list that we're able to get down to. And from a standpoint of, yes, there's some very high dollar medications that some patients use, and it will save a tremendous amount of money to the healthcare pharmaceutical delivery system. But I also see medications that I encounter as a community pharmacist every single week. And I'm glad to see that come down to the patients. Some of them come down to help the patients that I see so often, and they struggle to pay for it. So.
Okay, and I actually need to recant my last statement, having real-time input and clarification from my wonderful team and legal counsel that a vote should be called, and I believe we have that teed up, Vice Chair Bailey, in the prepared meeting guide for you. If not, we can help you out with that, I think.
Yes, thank you for that additional guidance,
Thank
Ralph.
you.
Shelley,
Thank you, team.
yes. So I suppose here as vice chair that I just want to reinforce that we do need to take a vote on the selection of the subset of prescription drugs for moving forward with an affordability review. So as vice chair, I ask for a motion to approve the drugs that we had on our list.
A motion.
Dr. Burns, thank you for the motion. Is anyone able to provide a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. And Melissa, if you could please call the roll.
Richard Bruno. I think you may have had to leave. Amy Burns,
Aye.
Daniel Hartung,
Aye.
Robert Judge,
Aye.
John Murray,
Aye.
Vice Chair Shelley Bailey.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Perfect. Well, Melissa, thank you for helping support us related to the roll call. And so I do believe our next step here would be to hear a bit. Well, I guess, Ralph, are we switching back or are we talking about insulin?
We are going to move to slide 7 on insulin, but if I may ask a quick clarification, friendly reminder from Melissa and Vice Chair Bailey, I am seeing the need for us to likely extend the meeting by 15 minutes and have a hard stop, but I want to just check in with Melissa procedurally if we need a vote to do that. I don't recall.
We do not need a vote.
We do not. Great. Vice Chair Bailey, so that we ensure ample time for this conversation and hopefully be able to have a conversation on recommendations, as we've had such great conversation here. Any objections from you or the board if we are to run the meeting to 11:45 to ensure that we have time for those that have signed up for public comment as well?
I have no objections.
Great. Thank you. All right. And if you would, Melissa, take us to the first slide of the insulin set, and I will set this discussion up for Amanda to walk through. So board members, I honestly was not sure how I wanted to tee up this conversation with you until I came across an article just the other day in the Journal of American Medicine's Health Forum from November of 2021. It was an original investigation entitled Estimation of Share of Net Expenditures on Insulin Captured in the United States by Manufacturers, Wholesalers, PBMs, and Pharmacies and Health Plans from 2014 to 2018. It was authored by Karen Van Nuys, Rockio Ribeiro, Martha Ryan, and Niraj Sood, none of whom, for the record, I know, but I do want to just share with you the very simple findings from that study as my intro to this conversation. Results: between 2014 and 2018, mean list prices of 32 insulin products increased by 40.1%, from $19.60 to $27.45, while mean net prices received from manufacturers actually decreased by 30.8%, from $10.53 to $7.29. Net expenditures per 100 units of insulin increased by 3.2%, from $15.11 to $15.59, while the share of the hypothetical $100 insulin expenditure accruing from manufacturers actually decreased by 33%, from $69.71 to $46.73. And the share accruing to health plans decreased by 24.7%, from $13.82 to $10.40. Couple final nuggets here. The share of insulin expenditures retained by pharmacy benefit managers increased by 154.6%, from $5.64 to $14.36. And finally, the share retained by pharmacies increased by 228.8%, from $6.21 to $20.42, and the share retained by wholesalers increased by 74.7%, from $4.63 to $8.09. So just as I close this out and tee up to Amanda, I'm going to share one last piece that most of the folks in the room know. Lots of good conversation in the last panel, or last piece, around how long drugs have been on the market. Suspecting most of you know that insulin was actually invented in 1921, more than 100 years ago. That's exactly why we're having this conversation today. With all of that said, Amanda, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Ralph, and excellent context there. So number 7, for insulin drugs marketed in the US and available in Oregon, consider the criteria for selection may include, but not be limited to, those products with the highest insurer reported overall spend, per patient spend, and patient out-of-pocket cost. Staff received 2021 and 2022 insulin information from the All Payers, All Claims, or APAC database. Please note, APAC data does not factor in the price of rebates or price concessions, unlike our carrier data. So I did want to put that caveat on there. We conducted analysis and categorized the insulin in 2 types. 1, intermediate and rapid acting. 2, intermediate and short acting. 3, intermediate acting. 4, long acting. 5, rapid acting. And 6, short acting. On the insulin report that is posted on the website, there is a tab which does have the FDA definitions for these insulin types. We also conducted a year-over-year comparison between 2021 and 2022. And with that, Melissa, if you can open up the insulin report and put it on screen, and we'll go to the analysis tab first, because I believe that's the best context for the board to get us started. Thank you so much, Melissa. And here on this analysis tab, we are showing some of those breakdowns of the cost information for the board to consider, such as the overall spend, which is the spend for both payers and patients, What that spend comes to per patient, so divided by the number of patients in Oregon. Those total patient out-of-pocket costs across all patients for the year. The out-of-pocket costs per person, please note these are annual numbers. So when you're looking at this, it's not a monthly amount, it's for the year. You'll see that year-over-year comparison between 2022 or 2021 and 2022 and column BB, column BC. This chart is broken down by the insulin type and then by the drug-based name, grouping together, say your insulin glargine, your insulin aspart, Lispro. We do have another table that if the board is more interested in the granular level of the data by the proprietary name of the drug, that table breaks it down once again by the type, the base name, and then you'll see, say, your different versions of Novolog, any generic versions, your Humalogs, Novolins, Humulins, so on and so forth. And with that, then I would like to open up to the board to get some discussion on how you may want to start considering the insulin data.
I would say, in my opinion, we at least want to focus more, Amanda, on the list that you shared that have the trade names, because that's more like names and NDCs. And I'm assuming we are kind of calling out, just like we did with the carrier data, like specific drugs for our list. So that would be, from my perspective, the lens we would want to look from. Mr. Judge?
Thanks, Vice Chair Bailey. I think we were thinking alike. When we are tasked to select an insulin, are we tasked to select it by its trade name or proprietary name? I'm assuming that answer is yes, right? Okay. So the way that it's represented here, I think the way you have the data organized, it's organized that way. Just kind of a follow-up question, because it was looking at total insured paid, the member share, and then there was one other kind of cost element in kind of what we're looking at. Out of pocket, I think, is what it was. Do we need to consider kind of the how widespread the utilization of these insulins? I mean, how do we do the most good for as many people as possible? It's kind of how I'm thinking about it. So I think there's other criteria to think about other than overall spend, patient paid, and out of pocket.
Oh, Mr. Murray?
Are we to take from this list and suggest half dozen for affordability reviews? Is that what our goal is at this moment? Or are we we aren't down to selecting one yet, right?
So to that point, and kind of responding to your question and both Robert Judges, yes, and that I think we would be looking at the proprietary name, but there's nothing in statute that says we only have to identify one insulin product. The statutory language is at least one. So deference to the board, what that number should be, and it doesn't need to be prescribed today. It should be what the board deems based on its work and our support as staff of providing you with information to make those informed decisions. So hopefully that's helpful.
And Dr. Burns?
Yeah, so this is a little less black and white, I think, than what we were looking at before with just that broad list. And part of that is because there are a lot of biosimilars and therapeutic equivalents. I mean, there's frankly generic on the market right now for some of these insulins. So I'm concerned if we're going to say pick by a trade name, that wouldn't be as meaningful as looking at,
Yeah.
say, and I'm not picking on anything in particular, but like say picking glargine, which, you know, obviously is going to be what a lot of Oregonians who have diabetes are using. And if we were to say, just pick one proprietary formulation of glargine, I don't know if we'd be getting at kind of the greater question around the cost. It's just, and I don't know that I have a solution. I'm just kind of throwing it out there that this is a lot more gray. And I know we're looking at 21 and 22 data, but I would argue that 23 is going to, you know, kind of fracture that market even further. So, you know, and looking at the glargine right there, I don't see, you know, there are other glargines that are currently out that are generics of both Semglee and Lantus that are on market. So it's a complicated issue, and I just hope that we can kind of try and be kind of, I hope that we're able to pick something that will be meaningful.
Sure, and thank you
Sorry.
for all of that. No, much appreciated, and good points. And to that point, we will do what is right. Is there direction from board that we as staff could provide additional information, or would you give us a homework assignment that might help inform additional conversation at the next meeting on this? I'm mindful of time. I'm grateful for the depth of this conversation, but I know we also have a recommendation section and opportunity that we need to get in for public comment. So if I could ask that of Amy real quick, and then if we can go to Robert Judge. And to that point, I would just say that, remember, board, that this a subset needs to be selected before moving to the actual affordability review process itself. The number in that subset is ultimately up to you, if that helps inform. But again, not wanting to rush the process. If you think there is additional information needed, we can try to go back to the well and provide that for you.
So I'm sorry, Ralph, were you asking me to answer a question?
Yeah, would there be any additional data that we as staff might be able to get or provide to you to help inform this conversation additionally? I don't know there is, but we could certainly try if you had something.
I don't know. I mean, Amanda and Brooke have done a really great job. There's a lot to look at here. It's just challenging because there's, you know, if we were doing this 10 years ago, it would be a lot simpler because the insulin landscape was very limited. So you were either, if you were on glargine, you were on Lantus, or you weren't on glargine. So it's, you know, it's a little bit more challenging. I guess my thought would be is if there's a way that we could pick something like, say, insulin glargine or insulin aspart or insulin lispro, and we then looked at that with the subsets of that, of the different you know, the different proprietary or labeled names that are available, and maybe look at it from that lens. But that would, I don't know if that would fit within the rules of this committee, and if that would be something that our, you know, my fellow board members would even be interested in doing. It's just, it's kind of challenging if we're going to say we're just going to pick, say, Lantus Solo Star. And
I do believe that if there was consensus amongst the board that insulin glargine were to the universe of those drugs could be narrowed for the review itself, if there were that level of board consensus or agreement. But again, I don't want to oversimplify this conversation.
Mr. Judge?
Yeah, maybe, maybe just to take it in maybe the opposite direction. I do believe that the availability of glargine or aspart has been, you know, beneficial for the cost of insulins and the impact on patients. So I know we have filters in here for biosimilar availability or brand generic availability, and so maybe to kind of help cull the list, we look at those, and maybe if there's a generic available, we don't select that product. We use that to kind of lessen the number of products we're looking at. Same with biosimilarity. That's one way to kind of give us a list that may be actionable against. And then to Ralph, to your question about whether there's additional information that we need, I think this is a pretty comprehensive set of data. When we're looking at how to narrow a list to a manageable list that we can do a deeper dive on, I think that's when we start looking at how many claims, how many belly buttons are unique, so we can try to kind of narrow a list to the drugs that would be the most rich in terms of potential investigation.
I'd say
And I realized rich was not the right word to use.
I'd say before Dr. Hartung and Mr. Murray, Amanda, you have your hand raised, so I wanted to make sure you could share what you wanted to share with us.
Yes, I just wanted to kind of bounce off of something Robert Judge said. So as a heads up, Robert Judge, when we marked for the biosimilar with the insulins, that's based on Purple Book data. Traditionally, that's been pretty strict when it comes to insulin. So even though you see all these different versions of the drug, they may not have been marked as such in the Purple Book. Really only Lantus was the one that seemed to, Lantus and related forms. So the glargines were really impacted. So I just want to give you a heads up that wouldn't filter a whole lot out of the list, but we can add that filter if needed.
And Dr. Hartung?
Oh, if I think John Murray had his hand up first, if he wants to go first.
All right, thank you, Mr. Murray.
I was wondering if we couldn't pick 2 rapid acting, 2 long acting, 2 short acting, being the most number of claimants or the highest drug spend per patient, and narrow it down somewhat that way and make a decision from there. You look at the insulin glargine list of brand names. In my opinion, a lot of the use or the number of claims is who gave one portion of the drug delivery system the largest rebate. And that's how it got on the formulary. That's what I unfortunately have seen sometimes, or so it seems anyway. So if there's a way we could narrow it down, maybe that would be a good start.
And then Dr. Hartung?
I wanted to get back to what Amy Burns had mentioned about, so when we select the insulin to review, is it conceivable we would select like one insulin, like insulin glargine for the review, and then that review would include all the different products within that molecule? Because for the affordability review, because I thought what Amy, what you were mentioning, kind of almost collapsing down on I guess the base name to create like this smaller list essentially.
Ralph, do you have an answer for us related to that? I mean, I think I know it, but it's probably better to come from you.
Apologies, I don't, Chair Bailey, and in all honesty, I'm captivated by the recommendation that John Murray made of potentially picking 2 from each of the insulin types.
Because then we could narrow down later. We would have the flexibility to look at multiple ones, or
right. And I think, and I won't articulate this as well as Dr. Burns did, but because there are some in the still scrolling, there are some in the insulin glargine category that net cost is disproportionately lower. So, and again, not stating it as eloquently as she did, but to that point, that the John Murray approach provides an interesting kind of slice of each of the insulin types and the market relevance to, again, not an expert in diabetes, but that 3 discrete diabetic populations each having different needs that we potentially could then identify where those pain points are amongst diabetics in the type of insulin that they take.
Thank you for sharing that, Ralph.
And Chair Bailey, Vice Chair Bailey, if I may, just kind of clock watching with Courtney, hoping that we might be able to table or wrap this piece of the conversation in the next 5 minutes to ensure that we have at least a few minutes for our recommendations conversation that we inevitably will not get through, because this has been such a quality conversation for which we as staff are very grateful of all of you, the board, and then to allow time for public comment. So if we can run this another 5 minutes and we will go from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ralph. Does anyone have any thoughts on what Mr. Murray shared about picking 2 from each category that we would add to our list to give us the flex? Okay, Mr. Robert Judge.
That's not a helpful suggestion, so I apologize for that. But I think that the approach that John suggests is a workable option, but my reluctance about it is if you look at an insulin category, whether it's rapid acting, short acting, you may have some categories that have more drugs in a category that may merit deeper investigation. So if we say arbitrarily we're going to put it at 2 per, we may be not hoping organs as much as we could.
Okay, so do you have an alternative suggestion then, based on, I know we're all going to share our opinion, but with that said, I thought I would ask.
Well, I mean, if we want to just, I mean, it's arbitrary, but everything seems to be somewhat arbitrary at this stage. Is if we said, hey, we have 167 drugs here on this list. Is that right? What can we select 10? And if we select 10, let's take those that have the highest spend.
Is there feedback?
I mean, I guess if I may, Robert, I see where you're going as well, but also not lost on, I think, what Dr. Burns' third point was and had intended to speak to this, something we've all talked about, and that is the change in the marketplace in the here and now in 2023 as we head into 2024.
Yeah,
so
right.
While we are working within the constraints of this data, we are actually working in real time, right? So what's the sweet spot would be the question to the board that will allow us to make a meaningful analysis that potentially will be meaningful to the legislature.
Hey, just kind of counter back on that. I'm sorry, Chair Bailey. We know that we got the glargines out there, we got the asparts out there, so maybe the board should be looking at those that don't have an alternative and make our selection off of that list, right? Instead of focusing, because we know we got the Civicas out there that are going to be creating this. There's a lot of choppiness in that part of the market that we're going to see. So maybe we got to focus on kind of the other areas where there's significant spend utilization. And maybe
Amanda,
not
could you
as many
show us
alternatives.
what that would look like if we were to do something like that?
I actually, and my apologies, I don't have this data set tied to that to do it live here on the meeting, but it is something we can filter on. Once again, those that are marked as a biosimilar is only a handful, so it would pretty much be your Lantus and related. But the bulk of the list would still remain if we filtered that out.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. So with a minute or 2 left for this part of the discussion, I guess I seek guidance from my peers on what we would like to do as our next steps related specifically to insulin. Dr. Hartung?
Can we table this for the next meeting? I need time to digest this a little bit, and I don't know if we would have time to try to get some outside expertise for kind of not clinical market expertise to kind of give. I mean, we maybe get to the smaller list, but I think even to select something for the affordability review, we're gonna, I think we have these intersections of clinical issues and cost issues, and that we could follow a path that's very simple. Say, let's pick the highest use insulin product we're going to do this again next year for the next list. So I mean, we just say, well, this is used by the most Oregonians. We can take a look at it. But I don't know. I feel a little bit like I'm operating in the dark here.
Yeah.
So
Ralph,
let us do that. And thank you for that recommendation, Dan. Let us work with Portal, our clinical contractor. I know some of those folks are with us watching today, and arrange for a presentation and discussion at the November meeting and go from there. And the value of this conversation helps inform lots of staff thinking for us to come back both with that presentation from our clinical advisor and from staff with another data refresh. So appreciate that, and just appreciate the depth of this conversation in general. So if folks are amenable to that, let's go ahead and table the rest of this conversation to pick up in November. And thank you.
okay, perfect. Well, thank you, Ralph. So I'm a little lost on where we're at next, but I think that, go ahead.
Oh, Vice Chair Bailey, we're going to move to recommendations. We're going to attempt to do that consistent with ambitious agenda in about 15 minutes, allowing time for the two parties that signed up for public comment each, which will have 3 minutes, and we hope to adjourn right about 11:45. Thank you. And Courtney, if you'd be so kind.
Thank you, Board. Vice Chair Bailey, thank you for stepping up for your leadership today. Melissa, if you can switch to the next slide. Just for visualizations as I start talking, I'm going to go through this fairly fast, so I apologize if I speak quickly. So what we're looking at is the feedback that the board members independently provided to us regarding a list of recommendations that we sent out. As you can see, this is the overall feedback that we received from everybody. We did ask for 2 categories, short-term and long-term. And I will get to those in just a second. But with the review of what you see here, the 2 primary or the most voted on to consider for recommendations to send to legislation this year is to lower the insulin cap to $35, which we're seeing a lot in the market these days. And then also the substitution, ensuring that statute language has the availability to substitute for generics, and looking at that more closely. Another set of recommendations that were also highly highlighted was the Secretary of State provided an audit, and there were some recommendations in there. However, if that is a recommendation that the board chooses to go forward, we will need some clarification because there's very specific recommendations under that SOS audit request. And we would definitely need some feedback from the board on how to look at those recommendations. Another one is the cost and fee reimbursement for pharmacies, and also the enhancement of PBM transparency requirements. So is there anything in this list that is not highlighted from everybody that the board feels should be more of a consideration or less of a consideration? And if you don't have any answers right now, that's fine. I can move to the next slide, which breaks down what board voted on with short-term and long-term. All right, seeing no feedback or hearing any. Melissa, can you please go to the next slide? So again, the request for the survey was to identify 3 short-term and 3 long-term for each board member. Again, the primary one that comes out is looking at ensuring that the cap for insulin is around $35, and then the cost and fee reimbursement for pharmacies to be looked at. Same question, is there anything within kind of the short-term recommendations that the board would like to move forward with for your recommendations to the legislator? And this report, the recommendation report, will have to be submitted by the end of December of this year. That's one of the reasons why I'm kind of pushing to ensure that I at least have the guidance of these recommendations so I can start working on the report. So you can see the draft by next month. And then the final approval will be in December before we submit it. So I see John's hand up. If you want to provide feedback, appreciate it. And you're on mute.
Just in the news, another pharmacy chain just declared bankruptcy. And while it only affects, and that's Rite Aid, not only affects one pharmacy in Oregon, which is in Portland, but I guess I'm voicing support for ones that support our pharmacy supply chain. I mean, I see it in rural Oregon. We see it in downtown Portland. We see it in all these places. So I guess I'm glad to see that. Will we, in our November meeting, will we see these highlighted then? Or is that what you said, Courtney? We'll see a draft of these recommendations based on our votes right here, correct?
Yes, and then I will develop a report to that the board will review and then provide any additional feedback to have in the final reports.
Okay, it looks like we have, clear recommendations for the first two on the short-term goals, but we're going to have discussion on deciding what the third short-term goal would be. So I guess I'll look forward to that conversation, unless it's supposed to happen today, or should it happen next month?
And we can also pull anything from that overall the overall list that was their first list. So Dr. Burns, you want to provide some information?
Yeah, it's just kind of a side note, but the allow pharmacists to prescribe insulin. I mean, that's already part of their scope of practice in certain circumstances. So I don't know that we'd want to include that.
And that's understandable.
Courtney, if I can, because I think this, we need to say this part, and apologies to everyone that we're not able to give this the time we had hoped to today in conversation, but a lot of this is that we as staff will be working with you individually as well over the coming weeks, because while some of these things scored high or received a higher ranking, such as the cost plus model in pharmacy reimbursement, we need to be able to have conversations with you to fully bake those for the board to look at in the construct of, at the end of the day, what would that recommendation do to lower the cost of drugs for Oregonian? So not losing sight of anything or being dismissive in the least way of actions that would promote transparency, and that is certainly within our purview, but we as staff will need to work with you to specifically kind of drill down and identify your talking points or perspectives on what that action would do to promote affordability. And so just want to make that comment. Thank you.
So Robert, before I go to you, would it be more meaningful for the board to actually review the drugs that are on the overall slide? So Melissa, can you go up one slide, please? Since this has more kind of breadth and depth between long-term and short-term, is these recommendations more what the board would like to fall under? Or is it more meaningful to do under the short-term and have it broke down? All right, I'll give you a second to think about that because I want to get to Robert because I know that he's had to stand up for a minute.
Yeah, and I think my comment may play into what you're asking about, Courtney, but I'm not quite sure because it's maybe unpopular. I understand that we have it within our mission to be able to recommend to the legislature, options and programs or policies to kind of affect affordability. But we've got a mountain of work in front of us in terms of just getting to drug selections. And so I'm wondering what the urgency is to have a short-term set of recommendations that we could include in this December's report versus being not more thoughtful, but having the opportunity to put more thought into recommendations that might take longer to put together. Because I'm sure everyone who scored on this has an opinion for what they were thinking. And I'd like to hear those thoughts. And I think as a board, it would be appropriate for us to have discussions on each of these if they're going to be considered for a vote. So I'm wondering if we're rushing this too quickly.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I definitely hear what you're saying. So one of the things, the reason why we're kind of rushing or, you know, providing this information is because we are statutorily required to submit the report by the end of December to provide some sort of recommendation into the short session. Whether they pick them up or not, like they did last year, is depend on the recommendation. So we're just trying to meet the statutory requirement under SB 844 to submit the report. So, and we can continue to have these conversations because within the report under the affordability review stuff, we still have the requirement to still produce recommendations into that report. So we can, you know, put some of these in there as well, but we're still trying to meet that statutory requirement. But again, as Ralph was saying, if there's anything more specific that the board would like to provide staff for thoughts or consideration on some of these recommendations, we can, you know, have a touch base independently.
Yeah, I think if we can, maybe Robert, if you wanted to close that out, and then let's recognize John. And then to that point, we probably should table this and work with board members individually and vet some of these into more substantive kind of draft recommendations that they can have the same level of in-depth of conversations that they so wonderfully had this morning on affordability reviews on this in November, and recognizing that may compress some timelines. That's what we need to do to give this the time that it deserves in conversation. So Robert, if we can, and then
just,
John.
Yeah, just it'll be very quick. So, and Courtney, thank you for that explanation. So that it's just a decision to elect 3 for short and 3 for long is a decision that staff is recommending. But we could equally just choose one, right?
Yeah, so if there's anything that the board feels is the most relevant or prevalent to focus on through or the overall recommendations, the board can select one. If there's more or the top, you know, 5 or so that the board would like to carry forward, then. But I know that we're kind of running against the time, and as Ralph said, we can kind of table this. Just know that within the next board meeting and the December 1, it will probably be a very tight development of the report to meet that requirement. But John, I want to get to you before we have the.
I appreciate it. Thank you. And I can hold my points for discussion until November, but I guess I would argue against the idea that, you know, we can boil it down to one recommendation, or we can remove short-term or long-term. Some of these things like transparency in PBM reporting, that's going to take a little bit of time. Having more pharmacies go out of business, that's likely to happen in first quarter 2024. So there is a short-term urgency for a certain number of things, and I'd be happy to explain that in November. Thank you.
It sounds like this should come back for next month's meeting for further discussion. So we will just continue to have our independent conversations with the board throughout the month and then set up for more fruitful conversation in November. So, all right. Well, thank you all. I appreciate your time on this.
Yes, thank you. And Courtney, thank you for your work, and Melissa on this, and to team and board. I would say such a terrible problem that we have to get this work done in November, because we had such a meaningful and good conversation that needed to happen today. So all good stuff, and we appreciate that. Vice Chair Bailey, again, gratitude to you for facilitating today. I believe, as I defer to you to facilitate public comment, I believe we have 2 parties signed up.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So this portion of the agenda is for public comment or requested in advance. The board received 2 written comments and 1 request to provide oral testimony. I call on the person, let's see, Dara McGrew, to provide oral testimony and ask them to state their name and organization before they begin. Melissa, if you could please unmute hello, Dara, there you are. As a reminder, the board will not deliberate on any issues or requests during the public comment period. And also wanted to let you know, Ms. McGrew, that you have 3 minutes to provide your testimony.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chair, members, staff. Daria McGrew, Policy Director on behalf of Pharma. Really want to commend the thoughtful discussion here today. This is a lot of data to digest, and I think it's enlightening for everyone to hear the discussion and thoughts there. As per our comments this month, first, for members of the public, it's even more confusing. It's not always easy to understand the factors that are being used to analyze or filter the data month after month, especially if you aren't able to follow every single meeting, as many people are not. I do note that the PDAB website has now posted detailed data definition and source documents, which is helpful for everyone to understand what each of the column or criteria on the working table means. Additional transparency and explanation is appreciated. Second, we do request, however, additional transparency or explanation on any of the analysis done by staff. We ask that it be explained, perhaps in a narrative document, when meeting materials are published. Drugs have been added to the list over the past 2 months, removed, added back without clear narrative as to why or how. I understand the intention may be to discuss at the meeting, but public comments are due 72 hours before. Therefore, stakeholders are reviewing the data just based on the meeting materials and slides prior to the meeting without full context. So we request additional information about analysis, particularly as changes are made to any of the tables under discussion. Lastly, we again request that you create a system for manufacturers to submit questions or provide input on data where they may see something as inaccurate or incomplete. This has been done in a few of the other state PDABs, and we think it's a good practice. Thank you for your time.
Perfect. Thank you, Ms. McGrew. So there being no further business before the board, we do need a motion and a second to adjourn the meeting.
I'll move
So
to
moved.
adjourn.
I'm sorry, John.
Oh, excuse me, Robert. I'll second.
Yeah.
Sounds like we have a motion from Mr. Judge and a second from Mr. Murray. So all in favor to adjourn the meeting, please say yes.
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 Any opposed, please say no. All right, the meeting is adjourned. And let's see, I didn't look at my notes for the next meeting date next month. Ralph, would you please be able to provide the meeting date? Or
That is Wednesday, November 15th, same time, same station. Thank you all so much for your work with us today and for those that joined.
thank you.